Good morning. I think we can begin now. Good morning. Thank you for being here at the American Enterprise Institute this morning. My name is Aparna Mathur, and I'm a resident scholar in economic policy studies at AEI. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to what promises to be a fantastic conference on the role of family structure in economic success in America. The report, which is being released today, is authored by Robert Lerman and Brad Wilcox, and you can find copies of it outside, and I encourage you to read it in depth. It's a fascinating study. It is on an extremely relevant topic since the national conversation has been focused on issues of economic mobility and inequality in America. And there is a need today to not only quantify the extent of inequality and stagnation or mobility, but the reasons for why it is happening. And this report places a premium on the role of family structure, on the role of stable family structures in as being correlates of mobility and inequality. And it talks about how the retreat from marriage may be correlated with these factors. Since the 1980s, there has been a significant decline in the traditional family as the share of homes headed by a single mother has doubled. Single mothers have a much higher rate of poverty than two-parent families, and 1/3 of all children now live in single-parent families, and child poverty rates in these families are 4 times as high as in married parent families. These differences in income translate into worse economic outcomes, not just for the current generation, but for future generations. Research suggests that children growing up in single-parent families have lower educational attainment than those who grew up with both biological parents. Moreover, they fare worse on a number of other dimensions as well, such as their social and economic development, their health, and their success in the labor market. They are at greater risk of parental abuse and neglect, more likely to become teen parents, and less likely to graduate from high school or college. So there appears to be a vicious cycle in which poor outcomes for the mother or the single parent translate to lower economic mobility for the children. To explore this topic in depth, we will first begin with Robert Lerman, who will talk about the findings of the study for about 15 minutes and the broader significance of the study. This will then be followed by a distinguished panel of speakers. For the first panel, we have Isabel Sawhill, Elizabeth Jacobs, and AEI's Nick Eberstadt, who will offer their views on the findings. We will then open up for discussion with the audience. The second panel will begin at 11, and I will let Brad Wilcox and Robert Duarte take over at that point. So before we begin the first panel, let me just mention that the hashtag for this event is #FamilyEcon, if you plan to tweet about it. And also let me provide a brief introduction to our speakers. Robert Lerman is the Urban Institute's first Institute Fellow in Labor and Social Policy and is Professor of Economics at American University. He conducts research and publishes on how education, employment, and family structure work together to affect economic well-being. Lerman was director of the Urban Institute's Labor and Social Policy Center from 1995 to 2003. And in the 1970s, he worked on reforming the nation's income maintenance programs and on youth employment policies as staff economist for both the Congressional Joint Economic Committee and the U.S. Department of Labor. Isabel Sawhill is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, where she serves as co-director of the Budgeting for National Priorities project and co-director of the Center on Children and Families. In 2009, she began the Social Genome Project, an initiative by the Center on Children and Families that seeks to determine how to increase economic opportunity for disadvantaged children. In addition, she has authored or edited numerous books and articles, including Creating an Opportunity Society, 1% for the Kids, New Policies, Brighter Futures for America's Children. Her most recent book is Generation Unbound, Drifting into Sex and Parenthood Without Marriage. Sawhill helped found the national campaign to prevent teen and unplanned pregnancy and now serves as president of its board. Elizabeth Jacobs is Senior Director for Policy and Academic Programs at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Her research focuses on economic inequality and mobility, families, economic security, poverty, employment, social policy, social insurance, and the politics of inequality. Before joining Equitable Growth, she was a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, co-founder of Brookings' popular Social Mobility Memos blog, and frequent commentator on inequality, mobility, and implications of the Great Recession for American families. Nick Eberstadt, a political economist and demographer by training, holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at AEI. He is also a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research, a member of the Visiting Committee at the Harvard School of Public Health, and a member of the Global Leadership Council at the World Economic Forum. He researches and writes extensively on economic development, foreign aid, global health, demographics, and poverty. And he is the author of numerous monographs and articles on North and South Korea, East Asia, and countries of the former Soviet Union. So I welcome you all, and I would like to start with Robert Lerman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Excuse me. And I want to thank AEI and the Institute for Family Studies that has sponsored this research. And I want to get right into what we're talking about because I have limited time and a lot of stuff. So, although what Parna said was accurate and in some ways needs not much elaboration, I think it's important to remind ourselves of where we are. And one place is this constant discussion of inequality and economic mobility, as the president argued in the December 13 speech, as the defining challenge of our time, jeopardizing middle classes, America's basic bargain. Now, the president didn't mention family structure in that speech, although he has mentioned fatherhood responsibility in a variety of talks that he's given. Now, on the Republican side, there's more of a focus on opportunity than inequality, but still there's a notion that America is growing apart. And we saw the peak interest in the inequality issue this past summer with the amazing phenomenon of a very thick and very technical book by Thomas Piketty, a French economist, on capital in the 21st century. It became a bestseller, and it was all about inequality. And again, this often morphs into this problem of middle-class incomes. In Sunday's Times, Nick Kristof had a piece called "The American Dream is Leaving America." So we see this massive economic and political commentary on inequality and opportunity and stagnant middle-class incomes, but only rarely do we see a mention of this key factor of the changing structure of American families. We see it occasionally, but very rarely relative to its importance. It's not discussed at all in the debate over Thomas Piketty's book. It's virtually ignored in a whole inequality series that Joe Stiglitz has run in the New York Times. Even Janet Yellen, who has written about this subject, when she gave a speech just last week about inequality and mobility, did not mention this critical factor. So what we try to do in this report is, in a sense, update a lot of information that has been discussed in the past, with a focus on, one, stagnant median incomes, rising inequality, upward mobility, and adult economic success. We have been happy to see that there is some additional scholarly work that has appeared in the last few years, in addition to Bell's recent book, including a piece in Demography on family structure and inequality, a book by Carolyn Hill, Harry Holzer, and Henry Chen called Against the Tide, which was done in 2009, looks at some of the same data, only for a younger group. And then this recent working paper by Raj Chetty and colleagues on family structure and economic mobility by geography. I'll come back to that. So let's get right into our results, and we're going to begin with income stagnancy, inequality, and declining men's employment, and then move on to mobility, marriage, and economic success in 2 cohorts. So this graph tracks what's been happening in terms of the income growth, median income growth of different types of families. On the top, you see married family heads. And by the way, these data are from the current population survey, but I use the personal consumer inflator from the GDP accounts, which takes account of changing mix of goods in the deflating of the incomes. So what you see is a moderately considerable increase for married couples. You don't see very much. That middle line is for all families. And on the bottom, you see the unmarried. The unmarried have a slight increase as well, but it's nowhere near as much as the increase for married couples. And at the same time, we see this big decline in the share, as I mentioned before, in the share of parents. And by the way, these are families with children that we're talking about. Big decline in the share of married parent families from nearly 80% in 1980, and it was even much higher in 1970. But just from 1980 to 2012, you see this big decline. So we try to isolate the part that was associated with the change in family structure. And what we find is that married couple family median income growth was about 30% in real terms over this period. Single parents was about 16%. And overall, it was about 14%. And how can they overall be less? Because there's this changing mix. But if you reweight and you look at it in terms of what would have happened had the marriage structure remained constant, overall family income, median family income, would have risen by about 22%. And that's in a way a conservative estimate, because there's been a shift in the mix of married couples toward, we had a big influx of immigrants from very poor countries, many of whom now make up a good share of married couples. So that, sorry, I have this on a slide here. So these are the numbers. Okay, so the next, we look very quickly at income inequality, 3 ratios, the ratio of incomes, the 75th to the 25th percentile, the 90th to the 25th, the 90th to the 10. And you can see the top 2 rows is where all of the discussion is, with very high growth rates in inequality. But then when you begin reweighting, what you see is that the family structure component is somewhere around the about 1/3. Now that's a huge chunk for something not to be talked about. So, and as I said before, if you exclude the immigrants from poor countries, the impact is even greater. When we turn to men's employment, we see a big decline in men's employment secularly. And past work that I did with Avner Achituv shows that there's a causal role for marriage in men's hours worked. We see this huge decline in the percent of men who are married. And if we go through it, and it's in the text, I can't go through it in detail here, we see that approximately 37% of the decline in the employment population ratio of men, prime age men 25 to 50, could be accounted for by this decline in marriage rates. Okay, we're now going to turn quickly to mobility. And these data come from the 2 cohorts. Cohort of 14 to 21-year-olds in 79 who we follow through their mid-40s, and a cohort of 12 to 17-year-olds in 1997 that we follow until their late 20s, 28 to 30. But if we just look at what happened over this period, you can see that the share as teenagers growing up with both parents dropped dramatically. This is with both, we have a separate column here for step-parents. So it's not quite as big a drop for step-parents, but for the two biological parents, there's this drop of about 20 percentage points, which is a massive change. Most of it is made up by a rise in single parenthood, some by step families. So how do we look at how family structure is related to outcomes? We kind of simplify it a bit. We look at the impact of both biological parents relative to single parents. We look at step parents relative to single parents. And about the 4% of those that are none of those categories we leave out. And here are some of the factors that we look at: high school diploma, single parenthood, unwed fatherhood, hours of work, personal and family income, and we control for a wide variety of other factors aside from single parenthood. So we control, for example, for the mother's education, even for the mother's age of birth. In the regressions on family income, we control for family size and whether you lived with parents. And what do we get? Well, we get these massive impacts on not completing a high school diploma, a 15-point drop, percentage point drop for men, and 9 percentage point drop for women. And this is consistent that the impacts on men are much greater than the impacts on young women, but they're still quite striking for both. We get a big, excuse me, intact families reduce the likelihood of non-resident fatherhood and of single motherhood, again, by very large amounts. Now, these results don't control for original family income because we argue that that's part of being a single parent. You tend to have lower income. But even when you control for income, you get effects almost this large, a point or two lower. Hours worked, again, people from intact families by their late 20s are working more. They're earning more in personal income terms. Their family incomes are much higher. And again, this is controlling for family size and whether you lived with a parent. And this is for women. Also, we get these huge effects. Now, these effects, as the book highlights, are really on the scale of almost any other major factor that you look at, like education, mother's education. Even if you compare mothers who graduated college with mothers who didn't complete high school, and you look at that differential, it's in the same ballpark. The family structure is at least in the same ballpark. We then turn to outcomes as adults. We look at how marital status and cohabitation status are linked to outcomes, and again, control for a variety of factors. And here I summarize them as looking at the effects of marriage relative to college degrees, relative to race, relative to Hispanic status. And again, we're controlling for a test of qualifications, controlling for household size, maternal age of birth, mother's education, and the unemployment rate. And by the way, this college degree effect, this is, again, college degree versus not graduating high school. So marriage is on the order of that gap. And this is the effect for women in their mid-40s. Again, similar results. Finally, we also look at some approaches which try to control for the person themselves. And many times people say, well, this could be selection. We'll talk about that later. I don't have time to go into it now. But one thing is we're using the person's own status as their own control when they're not married. And what you see is you see these very large effects, especially on family income of people as they age from 25 into their late 40s. And you look at just how they're doing when they're married versus how they're doing when they're not married. They have the same personality, the same characteristics, and yet we see these big effects. These show you the effects relative to some of these other factors, and again, they're on the scale of race and Hispanic origin and whether you graduated high school. So, in my view, these findings are striking evidence. The causal part is sort of hard to identify, but these results are quite robust. And if you compare these results to other results, and after all, causal inference is not so easy in anything else. I mean, if we had, a more equal distribution of education, do we have causal evidence for that? No, because we can't run an experiment. But these results are quite consistent with the results of other studies. And just one striking quote from a recent study on family structure and mobility, that's an amazing paper, concludes with this statement, or makes the statement: the fraction of children living in single-parent household is the single strongest correlate of upward mobility of all the variables we explored. So I think that we've got to bring this back to center stage.
Thank you, Bob. That was fascinating. Isabel, we'll move to you.
Thank you. First of all, I certainly agree with Bob that these issues have often been overlooked in much of the policy discussion, and especially on the left side of the spectrum. I haven't read Janet Yellen's speech, but that's a marvelous example of someone who knows this area well. And if she didn't talk about it, she should have. Overall, I think this is a terrific report. It shows that marriage is associated with large gains in family income, better trajectories for children who grow up in intact families, and more work effort among men. Now, I have all kinds of technical and data-related questions that I could raise, and I haven't had time to really delve into the research here. And as you could hear just from Bob's presentation, and he's only skimming the surface, there's a huge amount here. And in my 10 minutes, it would not make sense for me to raise those questions, so I won't, but just want to caveat this with, there's an awful lot here to be discussed. I think in the main thing, of course, and the authors are very clear about this, is that in the past, many people have been skeptical about these associations because they say married people have different characteristics than unmarried people. We call this selection effects. And it's always been difficult, as Bob indicated, to completely adjust for that. And I think this report does a nice job of trying to address that skepticism. You just heard about the so-called fixed effects analysis that they did. That's particularly interesting. And they had other ways of adjusting for other variables that might be correlated with marriage. For example, they have in most of their regressions, as far as I could tell, your AFQT score when you're a teenager. And in all of the work that we've done at Brookings, that is a powerful predictor of all kinds of things. And so I was very interested that you had that in your equations. Now, I, for one, am pretty convinced, as those of you who know me, that family structure makes a difference to poverty, to inequality, to social mobility. We have done research at Brookings with what we call the social genome model that shows something quite similar about the effects of family structure on mobility. And in my new book, I get into these issues as well. There is, of course, plenty of questions that could be raised. I'll just mention one that that I want Bob or someone to address, which is when you do this reweighting, how are you handling the fact that female labor force participation has increased dramatically over this period? And are we assuming this is what things would look like if women had worked as much in the past as they do today? I mean, that's just sort of one of my slightly more technical questions. But what I want to really focus on is two big questions that I don't think we have any of us figured out the answer to, and I welcome this contribution to the debate. The first is, why does marriage matter? What is the mechanism that's going on here? Let's assume that it does. Let's assume it affects child poverty, inequality, social mobility. Is that because married parents have more income? Is that because they're better parents? Is that because they're different in some other way? Maybe they have more interpersonal skills, more soft skills, and that's why they have successful partnerships or marriages. And that serves them well on the job and in many other areas of life as well. I don't think we know. We've tried to do some disentangling of that at Brookings, and there's a new issue of the future of children that will be coming out soon that Brad has contributed to, and I'm an editor of, that is also trying to get at that in some new ways. But the next question, which we need to discuss, is assuming marriage does matter for all kinds of reasons and we want more of it, how would we get there? What are the policy measures that we would want to take? And the report mentions four policy ideas that the authors like. The first one is ending marriage penalties in the tax and transfer system. This has been discussed for quite a while. They cite the work by Gene Sterling and others. They note that it would be very expensive to do this and come up with a somewhat creative idea that maybe if we just reduce these marriage penalties for the first 3 years you were married, you would love the institution so much that you would keep at it even if some of your benefits, the tax or the transfer side went away. Interesting idea. The second, by the way, my colleague Ron Haskins has a new paper on tax penalties or penalties in the tax and transfer system, and he says it turns out they're not as large as most of us think. I don't know how to sort out that debate between Sterling and Haskins, but urge the authors to at least look at that. I think Brad has seen that paper. Next idea is to strengthen the economic foundations of families, and to do that in a couple of ways. First of all, they call for as many do right now, including the president, for an EITC for single individuals. In the report, they talk about single men, but I assume you really meant single individuals. You're not trying to discriminate against single women. So you should think about what language you want to use there. I don't think it's constitutional to have a tax system that only affects one gender. But I knew what you meant. The other idea here is to strengthen the child tax credit from $1,000 per child to $3,000 per child, and to make it refundable only against income and payroll taxes. Now, I have been trying to get information from the Lee Rubio team that has also been calling for something like this, and we've had conversations with their staffs and read everything we could get our hands on. It's still a little confusing what's actually being talked about here. If you read the Robert Stein article that's cited in the Lerman Wilcox report, he says that you don't get both the EITC and this refundable child tax credit, refundable only against payroll and income taxes. Now, I'm here to tell you if that's what your idea is, and that's what the Lee Rubio idea is, that is not going to help low-income families, because the EITC for most people is much more generous than what you would get as a offset to your payroll and income taxes, because if you're working, of course, you pay payroll taxes, but at the bottom end of the income scale, you don't pay income taxes. So that really needs a closer look. And that's not a criticism of the report as much as it is a criticism of the rather loose conversation that's going on about this idea in the media and elsewhere, where it's not being carefully defined what people have in mind here. Now, the third idea is what I call the Robert Lerman Policy Manifesto. It's called Let's Increase Apprenticeship and Other Forms of Vocational Ed, and I'm all in favor of that. We need a lot more career and technical education, I think. And the question is what's going to be the impact on marriage? They cite, as I cite in my book, and everyone cites, career academies as showing some quite strong evidence that this could have an effect on marriage. But there is a new paper, again, that they could not have seen before they wrote this report, that suggests, it's by Danny Schneider, and it's on all of the experimental evidence about this, and it shows that career academies is an outlier compared to all of the other experimental evidence on this particular question. So that's worth looking at. Fourth, how do we bring back the success sequence? This is the idea that first you finish school, then you get a job, then you get married, and then finally you have children. I'm all in favor of that. I've actually written about that. Ron and I have shown that this could reduce poverty a lot and put more people into the middle class. The question is, how do we get people to follow that sequence? And now I'm going to put in a plug for my book, Generation Unbound. You can't get that sequence unless you can slow down the incidence of very early unplanned childbearing. As I know the authors realize, we now have a situation where the average age at birth for women in the United States is much lower than the average age of marriage. The average age of marriage is 27 for women, and that's a good thing. Those marriages that occur at older ages are far more stable than the marriages that used to occur very early. But if you're going to get people to wait to marry until they're in their late 20s, unless you expect them to be sexually abstinent during their entire decade of the 20s, which I don't think anybody believes is realistic, you've got to have a birth control agenda here. And if you want to know more about what I think that should look like, please read my book. I'll stop there because I think I've probably gone over my time. Very good report, though. I commend it to all of you. It's very interesting.
Thank you. Bob, did you want to respond to any of Isabel's points about? Keep going. Okay, Elizabeth, thanks.
So I want to echo Belle's compliments of the report. I think it's fantastic. And in particular, I think it's fantastic, as Bob opened his remarks, for really putting families squarely in the center of our discussion about how our economy works. That's kind of a different spin on how Bob's put it, but we talk a lot about economic inequality, about mobility, and then kind of talk around the edges of how most people in America actually experience their lives, which is in the context of a family, whether it's an intact family, whether it's a family that's, a difficult, all over the place family that people are trying to hold together. But it's a family, so I think it's the right place to start, and it's sometimes remarkable to me that it gets pushed to the edges when we're talking about the economy. So I appreciate the fact that we're all here today because of that. So I thought I have sort of three main areas that I want to talk about. The first is a feedback loop. I think we've focused a lot on the way that family structure impacts economic opportunity, but I would argue, and I think this is implied in the report, that there really is sort of a cyclic effect going on, that economic structural forces impact people's probability and likelihood of forming a stable, intact family, which then impacts economic well-being and opportunity. So I just want to spend a little bit of time kind of thinking about the way that economic context can set people up for successful, stable family formation and family sort of protection, that people can keep their marriages together, because we've spent a bunch of time so far talking about kind of the second half of that circle. So I want to bring some of that first half of the circle back in. I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about why we ought to care about the family. I think we all kind of get that, but I just want to kind of hit that. And then as Belle did, I want to turn to policy, and I have a couple slightly different ideas that I want to put on the table in terms of thinking about policy in the context of supporting stable families. So with starting with the feedback loop, thinking about what that first half of the circle might look like, how economic stability and economic structure might impact family formation and marriage. And this is setting aside the fact that the report does really great work trying to separate out some of the causality. I think it's almost impossible to get it sort of exactly all teased out, which is why I want to spend some time thinking about that first half of the circle piece. So question one thing to think about. We know that economic inequality has risen substantially over the same period of time, that the marriage gap, the gap between higher income, higher educated family formation and low income, less educated family formation have just gone completely in opposite directions. At the same time, we've seen the economy change a lot. I'm not going to rehearse the numbers. You all have heard them a million times. But there's some good research suggesting that causal arrow in terms of the direction of rising inequality actually impacting marriage rates. There's reason to believe that the causal arrow might go that way as well as the opposite direction. So for example, there's research suggesting that the share of white women in their 20s who marry decreases dramatically in cities where wage inequality grew the fastest. So inequality explains about 25% of the decline in marriage rates for women in their 20s, according to one very good study out there. There's also research suggesting that inequality may be driving non-marital childbirth. I think a lot of why we care about marriage is because we care about kids being raised in stable two-parent households, and so it's worth kind of hitting on the childbirth and fertility thing in the context of marriage. So Melissa Kearney and Phil Levine have done research showing that low-income women are much more likely to have a baby outside of marriage in high inequality cities. And there, I've talked with Melissa about this, and I don't think she's able to exactly pin down the mechanism, but the idea really is that there's a sort of perspective thing. If you look around you and you see essentially no prospect of a stable, upwardly mobile economic career, the idea of just waiting for stability until you get married and have a baby, particularly for women who are biologically limited and when they can have the baby, I think those two things become uncoupled, and people make choices based on what they see their economic prospects being. So it's important to think about the ways that those economic prospects impact people's sort of quote unquote personal choices. So second piece as to how economic structure might impact marriage is looking at labor market opportunity. There's one statistic that I come back to over and over again when thinking about this. It's from Stephanie Coons. In 1969, by age 25, 3/4 of men could support a family of 4 on their earnings alone. By 2004, 3/4 of men could support a family of 4 on their own by the time they were 30. So it's 5 more years before people could actually do that. Same concept, slightly different numbers. In 1969, only 10% of men ages 30 to 35, so thinking about kind of prime married childbearing years for fathers. So in 1969, 10% of men aged 30 to 35 were low earners. By 2004, 25% of men were low earners. So just thinking about where men are in the context of kind of being able to fill the role that we sort of traditionally think of as what people want to do in a partnership, things have changed a lot for men, and there's good reason to think that that's potentially impacting family formation, both for men and for women. In short, growing uncertainty and wage stagnation in the labor market, especially at the bottom of the income distribution, can really increase family instability because it's changing kind of the choice set for both men and women. There's one good study out there that suggests that rising male wage inequality explains up to 18% of the decrease in marriage for both white women and more educated African American women. On the women's labor force participation front, I think it's sort of important to not think of the economic stuff as all about the fact that men's economic prospects have changed pretty dramatically over the last couple of decades. We've seen women's labor force participation increase. That's coupled with changing values. We have very different expectations of fairness and reciprocity in marriage that goes up and down the income ladder in terms of what people expect and want from a marriage. So you have women expecting more at the same time that men's ability to deliver has really gone down. And it's made marriage a much riskier prospect, I think, for many women, particularly, even low-income women who have managed to get a sort of foothold in terms of their economic prospects. The idea of creating a family with a man who, even if he seems like he's kind of got his act together, the world out there is not exactly, it's a pretty, people are pretty savvy about probability, even people who don't, technically believe, they think in terms of probabilities. And indeed, there's really great qualitative research out there suggesting that this is the case. Low-income women consistently tell researchers that the main reason they hesitate to marry, and these are women, many of them have a stable partner who is often the father of their child that they're raising together, and they consistently tell researchers that instability and the possibility of that marriage dissolving is the biggest threat to them, even bigger threat to them than the idea of actually raising a child alone, being a single parent. Whether they're right or not, totally open question, and this report suggests that they're not necessarily correct about that, but it's very much, it's kind of a fact to grapple with, that economic stress is terrible for marriage. It's bad for emotional health, it's bad for physical health, so these ladies aren't crazy. And the last point I would make on the sort of the causal arrow in terms of how the economy might impact marriage is thinking about economic instability as opposed to just thinking about people's lives in a snapshot. So this report is suggesting, there's a counterfactual suggesting that if marriage rates had stayed the same as they were several decades ago, that median income would have been higher and economic inequality would have been lower, which, take that as a fact. I would just suggest that it's worth thinking about the fact that we don't live our lives in one kind of stable snapshot in time. We live our lives over time, right? And so when you think about how people's economic lives play out over time, one way of capturing that is looking at income stability and looking at how much your income bounces around over time. And there's some very good research, some of it done at the Urban Institute, suggesting that income volatility has risen substantially over the same period of time that economic inequality has risen. And so why do I talk about all of this? Both in terms of thinking about people's kind of economic lives, but also in thinking about how that might impact marriage. It's very difficult to have a stable marriage if your economic life is incredibly unstable. And in fact, we know that husbands and wives correlated income instability is one of the big factors behind the increase in instability over time, suggesting that it's just that much harder to come up with kind of a stable economic life to support marriage. So that's sort of the reasonably quick overview of how ways of thinking about how the sort of the economic stuff might impact the marriage piece. Very quickly, why should we care that families are less stable today? I would argue, and I think everyone who's sitting in this room probably agrees, that families are central to the American economy. Families are central to how Americans grow the economy in terms of demand, consumption. We all, buy stuff for our families. I don't even want to think about how much stuff I buy for my family. But also in terms of supply, both in terms of kind of incubating the next generation of human capital, but also supporting the current generation of human capital, right? The point about people being better workers if they're married, having good, stable support in the context of the family is really important for both the health of the economy, the health of the economy today and tomorrow. So lastly, on the policy front, first of all, I want to start by saying that this is an area where if 10 years ago you'd have told me that one of the places where I thought there was the most space for left-right consensus about policy, if you told me that was in the context of the family structure debate, I would have thought you were kind of crazy. It was still very much a hot-button cultural issue. And these conversations, maybe I just wasn't part of them, but I don't think they were happening. And I find it really heartening that they are now, because I think it really opens up some room to do a lot of good for families, and hopefully also to just have some successful moment of left-right consensus at a time where that doesn't happen very often. So I'll start by saying that, which is not something I feel like I can say very, very often. So it feels really good to say that. And I will not surprise you to say that I think one of the best ways that we can encourage marriage is by supporting stable families and providing the economic context that makes it easier for people to actually both get into and then stay in stable, productive relationships. Part of that is because I think there are other positive outcomes that come out of some of the economic policies that we might put in place, and also because they just seem a lot easier to me than some of the kind of cultural social interventions. I met my husband in college. I was really lucky. My sister, who had the exact same educational trajectory as me with, some minor variations, but she is single, she's very productive, she's, not a disaster, she's fine. Except that it's a great indication of how much of marriage and how much of a stable partnership, how much of that is luck. So like we could give everyone in America a Match.com account or whatever like people are using, but that seems hard to me. And so I think maybe it's lazy, but the idea of focusing on the economic stuff seems like a little bit more productive. And one, rather than kind of going back over the policy recommendations in the report, which I think are great, I have some of the same questions that Belle has raised, but I think it's a fantastic place. The one thing that I didn't see that I think is actually really important, and again potentially opens up some consensus between sort of sides of the debate that often don't have consensus, is thinking about job quality and how this fits into marriage. I think things like scheduling predictability, things like flexibility, things like access to paid or at least job protected leave can be really important in the context of if you believe that economic stability is key to actually supporting both the creation and the protection and building of stable families. And I think the job quality conversation is one that belongs on the table in the context of family formation. That's, it's not just about wages, where I know we're all probably likely to have our own opinions, but there are other pieces that I think are potentially equally important. And then there are a couple other things that I could say, but I think I will leave it there in the spirit of leaving time for questions and for the rest of the panel to get their ideas on the table. Thanks.
Well, I too think that this is an excellent report, and I want to salute Bob and Brad for doing this. It's deceptive in a way because this is a short booklet, but there's an enormous amount of original and methodologically really sharp work in this. And if you follow research, you can see how much work has gone into this and how much new stuff is here. And to add to the benefits, this is short, it's clearly written, it's concise, it's so accessible, I think that even an elected official could read it. And that may have been your purpose there. But so anyhow, so congratulations. I mean, I think it's a tremendous piece of work. Since it's easy for discussants to add more work to authors' plates, let me suggest some additional homework that you may or may not choose to pursue. I hope that others will choose to pursue this. And this falls into the categories of causes and consequences. So first with causes. I don't want to give anybody the whirlies in talking about statistical method, but it was very nice that you did the fixed effects thing. But there are other possible unobserved variables that might turn out to be quite important to explaining the drama that you describe over this period of recent history. And one unobserved set of variables would be attitudinal, and that would include things like maybe religiosity, or what Belle's colleague at Brookings, Richard Reeves, describes as character. To what extent does this constellation of attitudes affect affinity for marriage? To what extent does marriage have its own instrumental effect on these character variables? I realize this is not exactly the easiest thing in the world to research, but it's a big question, and it's a worthwhile question for our society to investigate. A second matter, which may be a little bit more easy to research, is the impact of the explosion of criminality in our society since your, let's say, 1980 baseline. I mean, people who are in jail are out of your sample here because this is a non-institutionalized population that you're examining, but there's been a huge increase in the number of men who are on parole or on probation, and it seems not nutty to suspect this may have an effect on their attractiveness as marriage partners, on their ability to earn, to support families. One of the things which is quite devilish about our current social statistics system is the separation of those, whatever you'd call them, justice statistics from the rest of our panoply of socioeconomic data. I think there are ways of getting around this, especially now that the Census Bureau is hinting that it may link up administrative data with its CPS stuff, but understanding the extent to which the criminality explosion or the incarceration explosion has affected the picture that you present may be something that would be worthwhile. I mean, it seems to me it's a big lacuna in a lot of the work that's being done on family stuff. Now, as for consequences, there is a flip side to the marriage premium that you present, and I find that marriage premium really compelling. The flip side is the entitlement cost. I mean, what is the cost in terms of social services, transfers, and other sorts of governmental program expenditures for the change in family structure that we've had over the last 50 years? That is something which I think one can approximate without too much surmise, and you can also do it in looking at the different typologies of family structure and so forth, holding all of those things constant that you so rightly hold constant in your report. And I mean, to the extent that the welfare state is a highly imperfect substitute for a parent, I think it is very worthwhile to understand the sorts of public costs that have been entailed in the change in family structure. And actually, I think as much as some of the other proposals you make for public policy, this would get this right into the center of the public policy discussion. Because when you understand how much it is costing the taxpayer to finance the new sorts of evolving family arrangements we have in the United States, then you've got a discussion in Washington. And it's not just a discussion at the pulpit anymore. No, anyhow, congratulations.
Thank you, Nick. Bob, did you want to respond to?
Well, excuse me, thank all the discussants for their comments. I guess I would like to go back to this point of attitudinal and affinity and that sort of thing, which is very, very difficult to measure. But it seems to me that we tend to downplay it in our economic determinism of things. I do believe that economic prospects have an impact. That's one of the reasons why I'm so keen on improving career prospects for young people, and especially young men who are not doing nearly as well in school as young women. But nonetheless, even if you say, well, they're not doing as well, the question is, well, would they still be doing better than otherwise? I mean, the economy may be what it is, but how best should you cope with it? Should you cope with it in a way that makes things a lot harder for your family and for your kids? Or should you cope with it in a way that works well for you? As far as the factors, I would say this piece by Chetty, which looked at tax data. I don't know how many of you have seen this piece. It's available free through the NBER, where they look at tax records over a long period of time by geographic area and what geographic area you were raised in, and look at how well you did later on. And they themselves, it was surprising in a way, that they found this, but they found that the family structure factor was the largest impact on mobility of all those variables that they measured. So I would say that's pretty compelling evidence. I think that one of the things that we had just on policy, it's not in the report, but I'll make my comments anyway. In the in early 2000s, when President Bush was trying out this healthy marriage initiative, which, by the way, still does exist in the federal government, there was a lot of hope that maybe classes for people who, relationship skills classes and things of that sort, would have a big impact. And in the experimental results, they did not. But to me, that just means that our first go-around didn't work that well. And I think of it like, well, suppose you found that a class of first graders didn't learn to read that well. You say, well, no sense trying to teach first graders how to read. I mean, we have a huge effort in this country that has been going on, and a very contentious effort, in terms of sex education, for example, in high schools. Yet we don't have anything comparable in terms of learning good relationship skills. So one of the things, I usually say two of the things that are most important, financial education and relationship skills, two of the most important things for your life and for your career. We don't teach it. Even in the context of these, as I said, other elements of couple relationships like sexual relationships. So I think there are a lot of ideas out there that could be looked at. We just put out a few. I think what we're trying to do is, as well as Bell is trying to do, is to raise this to a high level, say that, just like when people say, well, what are we going to do about, capital gain income or the tax system or something like that? People first have to say, well, this is an issue. This is an issue we have to take seriously. And then we can sort of try a whole variety of potential efforts to change. I do think that the attitudes can change. Attitudes have changed dramatically, but the world is not necessarily linear. Where I guess it was Herb Stein that said, unsustainable trends are not going to last. And you can, there are ways to kind of make things a little more sober if there were enough signals all around you that, hey, your self-engagement is very important, but a lot of other things are pretty important too. And maybe if we raise those to a higher level, we would start turning this thing around. Thanks to Nick for the suggestions on the the incarceration issue and the entitlement cost issue. I think both are worth looking at.
Okay, we can turn to the audience for questions. Let's start there.
Thank you.
Please state your name before asking the
Oh,
question.
Elizabeth Graham.
And your affiliation.
My affiliation, True North Management Consulting. Mr. Lerman. Oh, I'm sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question. There's two questions. They're actually related. The first one is, how do you identify a man who does not have children? Does not have children for purposes of the earned income tax credit? How do you know the man does not have children? And the second question is connected to that, and that is, have you identified and predicted what the externalities associated with that tax credit would be, and consequently what some of the unanticipated consequences of that policy intervention might be? And I know that's not in your discussion, but could you hypothesize what some of those...
Which policy intervention?
The suggestion that the earned income tax credit of $1,000. I'm assuming there's going to be some response. So, but first of all, how do you know he doesn't have kids? Thank you.
Oh, well, we use different data sets. In the CPS, you don't know if a man has a child outside the household he's living in, but you do know whether he's not living with a child under 18, say, or even older. But you know whether so you can identify all the people in the family, in the household, and whether there's a child related to him in that household. You don't know, but in the other data sets, you know whether they've had a child at an earlier stage, let's say, who's not living with them. In the cohort data, where we look at like the likelihood of unwed fatherhood, we know at least what they report in terms of having a child. I think on the tax credit, I'll let Brad go into that because he's going to talk about some of those policy issues.
Did you have a question?
Hi, I'm Ted McCann with the House Budget Committee. A lot of the times we're looking at family income, and that's sort of a consistent thing I think that most people look at. But it seems to me, from a material standpoint, the more important question can be consumption. Have you guys looked at the consumption data and sort of how that changes with family structure at all?
I haven't. I think Bruce Meyer has looked at that data, and James Sullivan, but we didn't connect it. But I think your point is well taken. Consumption inequality is far lower than income inequality. In an earlier version, I did take into account a lot of the other transfers, but because we don't have that same data from CPS in the earlier years, we didn't put it in the report.
Thank you. Excellent panel. Thanks for doing this. My name is Michael Maybach. I have a question for the author of the report, Mr. Lerman and Ms. Sawhill. I think everyone here agrees that we want lasting marriages. Ms. Sawhill, toward the end of her remarks, endorsed the idea of expanded birth control because young people are going to be sexually active. Isn't it the case that studies show, Dr. Pat Fagan and others, that the more sexual partners people have before marriage, the more brief the marriage will be?
I'll let Bill answer that.
I want to take that.
I don't know, because,
Is it on?
I think that's a longer conversation. I don't know all the studies in that area. But, you know, I'm not arguing for lots of sexual relationships, and I don't think anybody is, but I do think it's unrealistic to expect that people are not going to have sex until they get married in their late 20s. That's the simple point I'm making. You know, I totally agree with Bob that we need more relationship education, and that should really get into these issues of you should not, I mean, you know, the whole, I talk about the so-called hookup culture in my book, and, you know, I think it's really a bad development. It's also heavily fueled by alcohol, by the way. I hadn't realized how much it was fueled by alcohol until I started reading that literature. So, yeah, nobody is saying, you know, well, we need this kind of casual sex. But I do think people are better off if they have some exploration of what a serious relationship should look like, and not necessarily marry the first person that they have a romantic attraction to. So I would go so far as to say that.
Did you have a question? Back.
My name is Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. To Mr. Lerner, you mentioned that Bush administration had that Healthy Family Initiative, and I'm just wondering, I mean, even in early 70s or late 60s when we came to this country, we were often referred to the communication courses, you know, when we had problems with our American colleagues or something of that sort. And those communication, you had a department of communication in many universities at that time, which most countries didn't have, including the country I came from, India. Now, given that, how come they did not develop that? Because it would be communication should be family communication, communication should be leadership communication, and much of it is in doldrums in this country yet. And we have had those departments, and why wasn't it developed?
I don't know why, but I want to take the opportunity to mention that there are some, you know, there was a rush to judgment, I think, on the evidence of the experiments that were tried, that were financed by the HHS, and to say that nothing would work. And we have actually an expert in the audience, Theodora Ooms, who knows that if you look at this array of other studies, some of which were done in, among people in the Army, that sometimes these relationship skills programs do have an impact. I don't say they're not a panacea, but I think we have to keep at it and you know, develop, as you say, a more sophisticated approach to the communication area. And by the way, I think that those kind of skills carry over into an array of employability skills as well, in terms of communicating with your supervisor and other workers. Those kinds of skills are critical on the job as well as in the family.
Okay, let's start here.
John Solid, I have a question for Mr. Eberstadt. Do we have any information on character and religiosity cross-sectionally that would indicate family structure? I'm thinking about, okay, the bad economy is hurting family structure in the U.S. perhaps, but I'm thinking about the Tibetans and how the economy's doing with the Kurds and in Libya. Are these, and how about going to Exodus and the Jews having to take a walk? I would think that those cultural attitudinal factors might trump economic factors. And in addition, they might move forward in one's life the attitude towards marriage. If someone's engaging in abstinence, perhaps they will get married sooner, and if they're not drinking. Thank you.
Well, let me try to address that as a data question. When I think about where we'd get the sort of information that I'm, kind of generally suggesting we need to look at what I was talking about, General Social Survey, World Value Survey, there aren't that many places where you can get the sort of data cross-refed with income and education and ethnicity and religion. There is some. Unfortunately, it's rather limited, but there is some stuff there. It would be really nice if our federal statistical system would step up to the plate on some of these matters. It's been illegal for almost 4 decades for the Census Bureau to ask anybody any question about their religious affiliation, for example. Congress put that into law in about '76. We've cheapskated our national data on marriage, so that for almost 20 years it's been impossible to calculate the odds of somebody's getting married and staying married. There's a lot more that our government could be doing for not a lot of money in government terms.
Sure.
Gerald Chandler. It seems to me that there's a lot of assumptions which I'd like discussed behind why this data is of interest. We can just be interested in it abstractly, but it seems to mean that the assumption here is that by understanding this data, we can have a better way of fighting poverty and creating better lives for children. So I have some questions about better lives and poverty. It seems that originally Ms. Matur said 1/3 of the children live in poverty. I think a better term would be that they're eligible for government assistance. So we have to know what we mean by poverty to see if that's really a true statement. And then for men who don't have children, it seems obvious to me that they would have less incentive to work, they could enjoy their free time, and it's only having children that would make them say, I want to, say, save money for their college or whatever. So if you look at the data, you might find out that the cost of having children is greater than the amount of extra income you have. So to go back to my original question is, why does this data matter, and is it just for fighting poverty, and what is poverty?
Well, those are a lot of questions. Let me use this opportunity to mention in more detail the work that I did with Avner Achituv, where we looked at both how sudden changes in economic opportunities affect marriage and how marriage affects employment and wages. One of the things that is often overlooked in terms of the impact of impact of marriage on men's hours of work is that one of the big factors in improving your wage over time is work experience. There's a gain in wages over time. The more you work, typically, the more you improve your wages over time. So what happens is when you have these periods of being of not working and of reducing your hours of work, or of not working as hard, of not having the same incentives to work, that not only affects your income at that point in time, but it affects your income over your career. And I think that's what has happened in many cases. What we found, for example, was not only did marriage increase the likelihood of working, but even remarriage increased the likelihood of working. So you could really see this pattern change in terms of initial marriage, then staying married versus getting divorced. Divorce would be a drop-off. Remarriage would be another increase. And that, to me, was pretty persuasive, that this sort of settling down idea that actually Janet Yellen and George Akerlof talk about in their work is really quite prominent, and which is what I think you have in mind. I think one other thing that I wanted to argue in this paper is that, let's not, many things we say are causing all these problems, maybe they're not the key factor. So, in particular, everybody is, there's a lot of people are very down on the market. I'm not. I think the market is a great thing. But if you think the market is causing all this inequality, then you're going to be much further down on it. If you think that there are these other factors and how people couple up and their attitudes about staying together, then you're going to be more focused on that. And I think that, to me, is the importance of these data.
I think we have time for one last question.
Clay Ramsey, a program for public consultation. I wanted to ask anyone, are there studies on the extended family, which for now I'll operationalize as you have 3 generations living and there are aunts and uncles and there's more than one household with children and it's within a 50-mile radius. Some framework like that, since there is a possibility that family is just a kind of dimension of which has the potential of being a mutual aid society, and the classic 19th century American family, or the kind of immigrant family that is in movies, an Italian or a Hispanic family, is just a very effective kind of life unit.
There's not as much as there should be on that question. There is some, and for example, you find that this is not exactly the same as what you're talking about, but single parents living in a household with their own parents have a much higher living standard than if they're living apart and having their own household. But one thing that piece of work I did about 10, 12 years ago was look at whether or not who can call on, does marriage improve the likelihood that when you're in trouble you'll get support from your family and friends? And the answer was yes. You did get more support, actually. You might think it would be just the opposite, that if you weren't married, you needed support more, people would come to your aid. But in fact, that wasn't the case. What you found was that when people experienced material hardship, married couples could more likely count on help from relatives and friends than unmarried couples. So, or unmarried heads of families. So, but I think as to your general point, I would say the extended family literature is not all that strong. It might surprise people. I remember when I first came to Washington and was working on income transfer programs, I was taken with the fact that we had all these relative responsibility laws, that if you got welfare, they didn't just count your own income. If your parents were living somewhere else, they took account of your parents' income or your uncle's income or somebody, that there were these notions of relative responsibility. And I thought, gee, that's crazy. How can you do that? And now I'm not so sure it was so crazy, but anyway, that's a footnote that shows the importance of your question.
Well, I would like to thank all the panelists. This was a great discussion. I learned a lot. I hope you all enjoyed it. We will reconvene at 11. We'll take a brief break now, reconvene at 11 for the second session. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Oh, you did?
yes.
What is your
Yeah, my hearing is not perfect, so it could.
It was very nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'll tell him that I saw you because
Yeah.
I understand. He tells me he's working hard. You'd know better than I would. But very nice to meet you.
Oh, you mean, how would you give it to them if they were?
Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Dorr, the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, and I'm very glad, thrilled actually, to be moderating this second panel on this great new report on one of our nation's most important issues. Prior to coming to AEI, I was for 18 years in public service in the state and city of New York in social services programs, working on issues and policies that had to do a lot with helping families who were struggling, often partly as a result of their family structure. So this is an issue that's near and dear to me. I also want to point out that this report is part of the Home Economics Project, a research effort of the American Enterprise Institute and the Institute for Family Studies that is exploring whether and how strong and stable families advance the economic welfare of children, adults, and the nation as a whole. This project will also examine the role, if any, that marriage and family play in increasing individual opportunity and strengthening free enterprise at home and abroad, as well as their implications for public policy. So big issue, important issue for the future of our country, and we have a great panel to discuss. I think the second part of this two-part session today, this is as much about where we go from here, and also further discussion of the relationships between the economy, economic well-being, and family. So I'm going to just briefly introduce. I'm a big believer as a moderator in very brief introductions because you have them, and these panelists are well known in addition. So starting on our far right, who will be our first presenter, is one of the co-authors, W. Bradford Wilcox. Brad is a visiting scholar at AEI. He also directs the National Marriage Project and serves as an associate professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. Before coming to the University of Virginia, he held research fellowships at Princeton, Yale, and the Brookings Institution. He is well known on this issue, and we are very glad that he's here. Second will be Ross Douthit. I'm sorry, I got trained on that, but showing that I am phonetically challenged, I still didn't get that right. Ross Douthit, problematic name, but great writer. He joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in April 2009. I'm sure all of you are aware of his writings. Previously, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger for theatlantic.com. Thank you, Ross, for being here. And then, after Ross, we'll go Michelle Singletary, who's here. She writes the nationally syndicated personal finance column, The Color of Money, which appears in the Washington Post and is carried in more than 100 newspapers. In 2010, she released her third personal finance book, The Power to Prosper, 21 Days to Financial Freedom. Michelle, thank you as well for being here. And then finally, on my immediate right, Jordan Weissman is the senior business and economics correspondent at Slate, where among various and sundry topics, he's written about the rise of inequality, the decline of marriage, and the nature of poverty and class mobility. He was previously a senior associate editor at The Atlantic. We're very glad to have you all here. I hope we have a lively discussion. I have some questions after everyone goes, and then we'll open it up for all of you. Brad, the man of the hour, take it away.
Well, I'd like to thank Robert and Brad Wassink and Richard Brake, as well as many people at AEI and IFS who have made today possible in so many different ways. So thanks to them first. As everyone knows here, I think today, 50 years ago, there were no major class divides in American family life. The vast majority of Americans got married, stayed married, and raised their kids in marriage. But today, things are different. The U.S. is increasingly separate and unequal when it comes to marriage. College-educated Americans and their kids enjoy comparatively stable and high-quality marriages. By contrast, less educated Americans, working class and poor Americans, and their kids are significantly less likely to enjoy such marriages. And the next few slides, I think, give us a sense empirically, demographically, of what's happening, what's unfolding here in America. So we can see that there is a large divide when it comes to divorce in America. The college-educated Americans are much less likely to get divorced here in the U.S. This is building on work by Stephen Martin, who is here with us today. We see that there's a growing class divide when it comes to non-marital childbearing, the start of family life, for kids here in this country, where college-educated Americans are not likely to have their kids outside of marriage, but everyone else is increasingly likely to have kids outside of marriage. And all this matters for me, particularly because it leads to questions of family instability and single parenthood. We can see once again that kids who are being born to college-educated moms have high rates, high levels of family stability compared to kids who are born to working class and poor moms here in the U.S. That's kind of what's happening when it comes to this growing marriage divide in America. And why does it matter? This is where, where obviously the report that Robert Lerman and I wrote is picking up. And at the macro level, the big story here is that this growing marriage divide is eroding the American dream. It's tied to stagnating family incomes. It's tied to growing family income inequality. It's tied to declines in male employment. And as we heard this morning, as Raj Chetty's work at Harvard suggests, it's tied to lower economic mobility for poor kids in communities across the United States. So that's sort of the macro story, and an important one, obviously, at that. How does this play out at the micro level? For kids, what we're showing basically is that kids who are raised in intact married families are more likely to steer clear of events like a premarital birth that would limit or derail their future economic opportunities. We're seeing that kids from intact families are more likely to acquire the human capital they need to flourish in today's labor market. And then, of course, later in life to work more hours and earn more money as young adults. And I want to underline the sort of the notion here, or the fact here, that we've been talking a lot lately about women's opportunities in the marketplace today. And what we're finding here is that women who are being raised in stable two-parent families are more likely to flourish professionally in today's labor market. So I think the family has to be part of our broader conversation about work and family here in the U.S. Then looking more particularly at sort of marriage and men, this is a point that was articulated, I think, brilliantly by George Akerlof in his piece on men and families a number of years ago. What we see here is that marriage seems to transform men, that they work more hours, they work more strategically, as my colleague EVA Liz Gorman has found, and they earn more money when they're married compared to being single. And that this marriage premium continues to exist today, even in an era that's much more egalitarian, which suggests this is not really about gender specialization per se, it's about the ways in which marriage and a relationship helps make men settle down, to use George Akerlof's words, and to become more strategic and on average more productive in their workplace. And when it comes to women, what we're finding is that marriage does not exact a penalty on women's personal income and actually gives them a substantial premium when it comes to their family income. And new work by Jane Waldfogel at Columbia suggests also today that the motherhood penalty, the sort of fabled motherhood penalty, is actually lowest among married mothers, who of course can share the challenges and blessings of raising kids with a committed partner there in the picture. I also just want to also highlight the point that Bob Lerman mentioned earlier, and that is that we have a lot of discussions today when it comes to economic mobility, economic success, poverty, incarceration, teenage pregnancy, about the ways in which race and ethnicity and education help to structure these important social, economic, and public outcomes. But we don't, I think enough or talk enough about the ways in which family structures these outcomes. And we find in our work here that the family factor, whether it's family structure or marriage, is often as powerful or almost as powerful as are things like education, race, and ethnicity in predicting young men and women's income or their family income, as these two slides suggest. So the point I'm making here is that we need to kind of reintroduce the family factor in our public conversation about these important outcomes and issues. And the next two slides, from different studies are also indicative of this. We find in work that Sarah McLennan at Princeton has done, for instance, that family structure is as powerful predictor of young men's incarceration as is race. And you would never get that from a public conversation about incarceration in America. Or that, once again, a major predictor of teen pregnancy in the U.S. Is family structure growing up. So my point here simply is to say we need to think about how family structures, not just economic success in America, but a broader array of outcomes that are a part of our public conversation today in the U.S. To wrap up this section, what we're suggesting today is the family factor seems to be about as, or almost as important as race, ethnicity, and education in shaping the odds of realizing the American dream, and that the growing marriage divide in America is a major source of social and economic inequality, and is one largely unheralded force eroding the American dream. So I was actually surprised to some degree at the amount of consensus that we got this morning from scholars from AEI, the Center for Equitable Growth, and the Brookings Institution about kind of the basic story. And I think the question becomes, why is this happening and where do we go from here? And while we would agree, I think Bob Lerman and I would agree that economics is a major part of the story, and I think Annie Lowry does a good job articulating this idea here. She says that, quote, from an economist's perspective, our collective allergy to matrimony might be a macroeconomic issue. That is, in order to save marriage, we'd have to end poverty. So this is sort of the classic progressive economic take on all this, and I think there's a lot of truth to this. But empirically, I think we have to acknowledge, as Bell Sahel Brookings has pointed out, that a purely economic theory falls short as an explanation of the dramatic transformation of family life in the U.S. in recent decades. We know from work done by Dan Lichter at Cornell, for instance, that when you look at changes in the economy, they only count for a portion of the retreat from marriage in America. And if we think historically, as this picture up here on the screen suggests, family stability, the two-parent family, was much stronger in the United States at the height of the Great Depression. So clearly, economics is not the only part of the story that we're trying to explain today, both in the report and just more generally. So when I think about sort of the causes of this growing marriage divide in America, I would talk about a changing culture. I would also talk about shifts in the economy. And one thing that's usually ignored in all this, that is changes in our American civic fabric. Taking a page from Robert Putnam's work, Bowling Alone. So quickly on the cultural front, I think we have to acknowledge that, there's no racial divide, there's no class divide really when it comes to sort of Americans' general aspirations to have a strong and stable marriage and family life. But we do live in a country and a culture where a kind of a capstone model of marriage has emerged that sees marriage as about both sort of signaling and reinforcing the fact that you have arrived both economically and emotionally in a particular relationship and a particular place in life. And this capstone model of marriage is less accessible in obvious ways to working class and poor Americans who have become in recent years less likely to adopt a kind of marriage mindset, both kind of globally and more particularly in terms of their expectations about how to conduct their lives. And one example of this comes from the political arena. I'm not making a partisan point, I'm making a generational point here. And a serious one, and that is that, in the 70s and 80s, many college-educated Americans got divorced and often remarried, and certainly Newt Gingrich is sort of one example of this. Whereas if we look, if we look more recently at the example of Barack Obama, he gets married in the 1990s and has obviously stayed married. But I think their experience is emblematic of a broader shift among American elites or among college-educated Americans, and that is they have become, I think, more prudent in their approach to family life and are benefiting, as we've seen in the previous slides. But culturally, to kind of lay that argument out a little bit more clearly, what I'm saying is that we're seeing some shifts in global attitudes, so that college-educated Americans have become more averse, more opposed to divorce in general, in terms of their trajectory, where unfortunately less educated Americans are moving in a different direction. But I think beyond that, there's a much more important cultural trend in terms of kind of people's discrete expectations about how their lives are going to play out and how their kids' lives are going to play out. So we see that college-educated moms here have kids, have teens, who are much more, like I said, they would be embarrassed by a teen pregnancy. Okay, so it's whether these college-educated folks are Republican or Democratic, secular or religious, the fact of the matter is that in college-educated communities around this country, there is an expectation that a success sequence unfolds. And it's about finishing your education, getting a job, getting married, having kids, and for most, staying married. That's the success sequence in America. And for any number of reasons, college-educated Americans understand that. They're doing it for themselves, and they're trying to get their kids on that agenda as well. And so the question becomes, can we extend that model to the rest of, our society? But I also want to mention the retreat from institutions, and that is that we know that less educated Americans, particularly men, are more and more disconnected from core institutions, from work and civil society that have long powered strong and stable families. So everyone knows that the shifting economy has reduced the economic fortunes of working class and poor men. And this next slide just gives you a sense of increases in unemployment. for less educated men. This is before the Great Recession hits, but the basic story still persists, obviously. And that is that the shifting sands of our economy have proved to be much more treacherous for less educated men than they have for college educated men. And that's one reason we're seeing this growing marriage divide in America. But what rarely gets discussed in all these discussions is the role of civil society in all this. We know, I think many of us, that Robert Putnam talks about a retreat from civil society in his book, Bowling Alone. But what he did not point out in his book is that this retreat is heavily stratified. That in both secular contexts, the retreat from civic engagement is stronger among less educated Americans, and particularly in religious contexts. Americans who don't have a college degree are much less likely today to regularly attend a church or a synagogue, a mosque or a temple compared to their better educated peers. And that's important because these religious institutions have long obviously given social support, marriage-friendly norms, and religious meaning to relationships, marriages, and to families. So to kind of wrap up the explanation piece here, I want to say that this growing marriage divide is rooted in not just economic factors, but also in cultural and civic changes that have undercut the normative, the financial, and the communal bases of strong and stable marriages and families, particularly in poor and working class communities across the U.S. Finally, where do we go from here? Well, we've got a few ideas, but I want to be very honest and to say that I think all of us, probably in this room, are thinking of ways in which we can strengthen and stabilize two-parent families, married families here in the U.S. And these ideas are offered in the spirit of contributing to that larger conversation about how do we strengthen and stabilize two-parent married families in America. So one idea is that we need to be clear in public policy about doing no harm and not penalizing, particularly in our transfer policies, marriage among lower-income Americans. And there's some debate about this, as Bel Sahil mentioned, but at least this piece published in the Future of Children suggests that there is, or there are penalties, particularly for transfer policies for many lower-income Americans. And if we could kind of eliminate or minimize those penalties, particularly at the transition to parenthood and the transition to marriage in the first 3 years of a married family's life, that might be helpful in getting them to get on this success sequence rather than avoid it because they're concerned about the impact that it might have on Medicaid or on something else that they're relying upon to navigate today's treacherous economic arena. The second point is that we need to strengthen economic foundations by both expanding the child tax credit and extending it to payroll taxes, and also expanding at the same time the earned income tax credit. And I say here about single adults with no kids. I don't specify by sex here, at least in the PowerPoint, but in ways that will strengthen the economic foundations of working class and poor families. We also need, as Bob Lerman has argued, to realize that most Americans will not get a BA or BS. Today, only about 35% of Americans actually get a college degree. And yet so much of our conversation, so many of our public policies are focused on college as the ticket to the American middle class. And there are many middle-skilled jobs, for plumbers, for electricians, for IT consultants, for people working on advanced manufacturing lines that provide real economic opportunities and a sense of worth and meaning, dignity to young adults. And we're not doing enough to connect our young adults and our kids to these opportunities. And I think we need to do a lot more with both vocational education and apprenticeship programs to make those opportunities available to kids who won't be on the college track here in America. And then finally, I think we have to recognize that, given my diagnosis about the importance of civil society and culture, that no matter what happens in Washington or in Richmond or Sacramento or Austin, if we don't do more in the civic arena, and especially in the cultural arena, probably nothing much will change with this trajectory. And that's why I think we need to think about some kind of national campaign modeled on the successful campaign that the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Unplanned Pregnancy has spearheaded on teen pregnancy, to tackle marriage, to tackle the success sequence in a way to strengthen marriage and families. And I think some folks, particularly progressives, are skeptical about this sort of possibility of doing such a thing. And they say, well, how can we really move the needle on this question? And my response to that would be is that we probably can't move the needle on that question unless there's a broad consensus around the importance of marriage and family. And if we could achieve some greater consensus on that question, then I think cultural change and civic change could do a lot, just like it has on not only teen pregnancy, but also in smoking and drunk driving, to change behavior in major ways on this question of family formation, marriage, and family stability. So just to conclude here, given the economic and the emotional benefits of marriage for adults, for kids in the nation, I think we need to do a lot more to renew the economic, the policy, the civic, and the cultural foundations of family life to bridge the growing marriage divide in America. And the alternative to doing this, the alternative is a future of durable economic and social inequality in America, where college-educated Americans and their kids enjoy strong and stable families that boost their economic opportunities, and to leave everyone else with an increasingly unstable family life that puts them at a permanent social and economic disadvantage. Such a future, of course, is unacceptable for everyone on the right and the left who is committed to a thriving middle class and to making the American dream available to all.
There. For those of you who couldn't hear me, thank you, Brad, for that presentation. Thanks to AEI for hosting this event. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everyone for being here. I'm just going to make two hopefully relatively brief comments, pivoting a bit off what Brad said that might be helpful for sort of laying out some of the terms of discussion, maybe the terms of disagreement, since maybe it would be fruitful to have a little more disagreement on some of these issues, because they are very tricky issues. But I'll start with a point of sort of optimism and consensus. This is not, as many of you know, the first event on marriage and family where I've been a panelist, and I and other people in the media and the think tank world and elsewhere have been working on these issues, writing about them, debating them for a while now, and many people in this room have obviously been doing so for a lot longer than anyone my age. And I will say, based on my somewhat limited experience, and I think based on others' longer experience, that there is a bit more, at least potential policy consensus around these issues right now than there might have been at some moments in the pretty recent past. And that consensus has not yet been distilled into an agenda that is about to pass the House and Senate in Washington, D.C., and indeed it may never be distilled into such an agenda, politics being what it is. But there is, I think, some real cross-ideological agreement, not necessarily on sort of diagnostic issues. I think there's still, a fairly significant left-right divide in terms of how much people emphasize culture versus how much they emphasize economics. But I do think that people whose emphases differ are increasingly likely to agree on a couple points. I think that there is at least potential emerging sort of left-wing / social conservative consensus around the idea that, well, we can't quite agree on whether these issues start with culture or start with the economy, but maybe we can agree that social conservatives can support a little more economic redistribution, as long as that economic redistribution is oriented specifically around work and family. And that, is sort of embodied in certain ways by the child tax credit expansion and the EITC reform that Brad and his co-authors endorse. And those are ideas, I think, again, they haven't reached the point of being embodied in any kind of legislation that's going to pass Congress, but they are ideas with some support in different forms, potentially at least, on both sides of the partisan divide. And I think that they represent a kind of natural bipartisan meeting point for addressing some of these issues. And then similarly, and Brad sort of gestured at it, but I think it's worth elaborating on, there's a kind of libertarian social conservative / left of center consensus that some of these issues can be addressed by looking at issues of incarceration and criminal justice reform, and that the shortage of marriageable men in working class and poor communities is connected to the fact that we put so many of those men behind bars. And while that's obviously not the easiest of problems to solve, because many of those men are behind bars because they've committed actual crimes, not just low levels of possession of marijuana, but more significant crimes. Nonetheless, there does seem to be real room, and there is movement on these issues at the state level and to some extent the national level for rethinking incarceration policies that were forged in an era of sky-high crime rates and that, maybe can be reasonably reformed in an era when crime has fallen and then stayed relatively low. And so I think that sort of combination, an agreement on a certain amount of redistribution that's targeted to workforce participation and child rearing, and an agreement on some experiments in criminal justice reform that might increase the pool, particularly of marriageable men, particularly in low income and minority communities, represents a really promising area for both, not just for sort of policy wonks to look at, but also for politicians to embrace and adopt, and maybe someday, God willing, turn into actual legislation. So that's sort of a case for optimism. And then on, I guess, a more pessimistic or at least more complicated front, I want to just say something briefly about where Brad ended up with this idea, which I think is entirely correct, that you simply can't do anything significant about this without some kind of cultural change around the way Americans and younger Americans are sort of conditioned and encouraged to think about the connections between sex, family, work, and child rearing. And I guess the reasons for a certain kind of pessimism around that front is it's both, as Brad suggests, that kind of change usually has to rest on some kind of national consensus, and that kind of consensus, given the deep, abiding cultural divisions around issues of sex and family, is, it's a little bit hard to imagine us achieving anytime soon. But there's also, I think, a further point, which is that even the sort of hard-to-achieve consensus that Brad is discussing around this idea of a success sequence, I think risks a kind of bloodlessness in a certain way, that it's a little bit hard for me to imagine human beings, as at least I know them and interact with them, responding to in a significant way. And by that I mean that the case that Brad makes and that I've made and that other people have made, both on the left and right, is a kind of utilitarian case here, right? It's an argument that if you do X and then Y and then Z, your income level will rise in year X and year Y, and your children will have an X better chance of graduating from high school at X pace and so on. And that argument is true and correct and important, and in a political landscape that's dominated by a sort of utilitarian framework, it's important to be able to make it. But when people make decisions about who they sleep with, who they get married to, and how they connect those decisions to having children, they're responding to both sort of lower impulses, quite literally in certain ways, but also to higher impulses as well, to aspirations connected to visions of the good life, of human flourishing that are often traditionally have been bound up in religious ideas, are bound up in images of what a happy family is, of what a good father or a good mother is, of what a happy childhood is, and so on. And so I think it isn't enough to imagine a cultural consensus that just makes a utilitarian case. That cultural consensus would have to involve some level of aspirational idealism around images of the two-parent monogamous family, and also some form of stigma around people who deviate from or don't live up to that norm. And both of those are even harder, I think, to imagine our culturally divided culture achieving. And I think I'll sort of finish up there, but just say briefly that I think the examples that Brad cites are sort of telling in this regard of successful campaigns. I think if you look at the campaign around smoking, for instance, that is a campaign that succeeded in sort of with a kind of obviously utilitarian appeal to people's health and well-being, but with a extremely visceral version of a utilitarian appeal. It wasn't just quit smoking and your health metrics will improve at X level in 20 years. It was quit smoking so you don't die, right? And that's a harder argument to make around, out-of-wedlock childbearing, because people who start families outside of the success sequence don't die. They have, obviously tragedies happen, but they have children that they love, and they move in and out of relationships, and those relationships have fluctuations and so on. But people are not. There isn't that same kind of stark incentive at work. And the other thing we did with smoking was that we stigmatized smokers. We didn't stigmatize them in a sort of necessarily finger-wagging way, but we stigmatized them by pushing them to the margin of restaurants, businesses, public institutions, and so on, and by sticking them outside and saying, look at those smokers shivering out in the cold. You don't want to be like them, right? And we used to do a version of that around out-of-wedlock childbearing, and I think for very good reasons we moved away from the particularly gendered forms of stigma that were attached to out-of-wedlock childbearing. But if you're going to imagine a future that looks different from the one we have now, you have to imagine some level of stigma that coexists with the aspirations that we're holding up. And I think the same is true in certain ways around drunk driving. Again, the sort of visceral fear, don't drive drunk or you will die, and we'll show you pictures of tragic accidents that teenagers have been in during our high school lectures on this. And you can do a version of this with teen pregnancy, and this is obviously what, in certain ways, Teen Mom and other shows have done. But again, the visceral quality weakens the older people get, and the more they're in a situation where they feel like maybe they're ready to have kids, and maybe they haven't met Mr. Right, or they have a Mr. Maybe Right who they want to try out while they have a kid with him, or some version of the same thing for men. And you just don't have that sort of visceral "don't do this or you'll die" idea. And then finally, and that sort of connects to teen pregnancy, we have made real strides in combating teen pregnancy. But to drive down the teen pregnancy rate, you are telling people don't have sex very carefully, use contraception very carefully, don't have kids, and so on, in a narrow time window, 4 or 5 years, while most people are still living at home with their parents or trying to get started in college and so on. And nobody at 17 is confronted with the prospect that they're being told, don't have a kid now because you're not at the right place in the success sequence, but maybe you're 5 years away from having your own fertility chances go down. This is one of the issues here, that to get people to sort of get into this success sequence, you're asking them to essentially take risks on their long-term fertility, their long-term likelihoods of having kids and families and so on. And you're asking them to take risks on people who, might not merit that risk. Take a risk on the man you're with right now or the woman you're with right now, that you can be married to them and legally bound to them and so on. And none of that is really in play in the arguments that we're pitching to 16-year-olds about how they shouldn't have a kid until they're out of their parents' house. So those are sort of the reasons to conclude that I'm both more pessimistic than the policy consensus suggests, but also that I just think there are sort of cultural debates and transformations that we would have to go through and get through to achieve a deeper level of change. Thank you.
Hi. Just in the interest of time, I'm just going to fast forward a little bit and talk about why this is important to me. Because I think we really have to put a face on this issue if we're going to affect change. So this is what I do. I write about this, but I also have created programs to help it. I'm not waiting for the government. I'm not waiting for another policy report. I'm trying to do it in my own community. And so I started a program at my church called Prosperity Partners Ministry, in which we teach people how to handle their money. It's not a one workshop program over the weekend. It's a 10-month program where I'm a drill sergeant, really toughening people up to handle their money well. 10 months. And not just that we build relationships. You want to make change, you got to build relationships. And so we assign people the equivalent of a money mentor. And on that same sort of road, my church has this program called, Marriage and Your Money. And so my husband and I teach that class, where we try to teach couples how to handle their money. But part of that program, it's 4 months. It's a long program. We build relationships. We talk about communications. And in both programs, we don't start with the economics of it. We start about the mind and the emotions and how you have to build a strong marriage by first addressing the issues in your marriage. Anyone who studies couples and money know that it's really not about the money. And then my church has this wonderful program. So you think you want to get married? I think it's revolutionary. It is not a premarital class. It is a class for people who are dating, who kind of think that the person that they're with, their boo, they want to get married to them. And so the goal of this program is to break them up, to be honest. I mean, you actually get a grade at the end, and the ministers go, nah, you should never get married to this person. That's what we're talking about. And I'm talking about it from the civic community point of view because, I'm very, skeptic of government programs because they tend to be very punitive. And in my program, I visit prisons. I'm part of the ministry. My husband and I visit both the men's and women's prison in Maryland. Again, long-term, sitting down with the inmates, talking to them about their money, and they're folks who are about to get out of prison, and we try to help them deal not just with the limited amount they're going to have, but how to deal with all the stuff that's going to happen when they get out there, particularly those who are in relationships and who have kids. And on to your point about the things that we have to do, for example, I would love to see more effort on the Ban the Box program, where we are not penalizing people with not giving them employment once they get out of prison. Because the fact of the matter is most inmates are going to get out of prison. And then we have all these folks who can't get jobs because we have on the application, have you ever committed a crime? Now, clearly, there are instances where we have to be careful about people that we put in certain workplaces, but we have to figure out a way to how to employ these folks who often have children. And so can we come up with a success sequence? Absolutely. My husband and I have been married 29 years, November 9th. That's right, clap. And I say that because we don't rejoice in marriage. Look at the cultural norms of marriage. Most shows, the couples are fighting. There's no joy. I mean, people talk about the ball and chain. My husband is not a chain. He is fine. 29 years later, I'm still in love with this man. Doesn't have the same curly hair that he had when I married him, but that's okay. And we have to talk about the joy of that. And I love the idea of this success sequence because I am the face of those people. I came from an abandoned home. Both my mother and father abandoned me. I was raised by my grandmother who had a husband in the household, but he was an alcoholic. So essentially, it was a single-family household. I know the benefits of marriage. I chose to follow that sequence. And that because I chose to follow that sequence, I have changed not just the legacy of my immediate family, but my family in general. Because now my husband and I have resources to help people go to college. And so my niece went to college. And because she had a kid out of wedlock, but we still supported her, and now she's married with that man. And so this is real stuff. I followed that sequence because I knew that was the success story for my life. I got married when I was 29. We waited 5 years because I wanted to be sure that we had a strong marriage. We went to counseling. We went to programs at our church to strengthen our marriage before I brought children into this world. And this is not just about fertility. You should not bring children into this world if you don't. I believe that you should have a strong partnership with your spouse before you bring children in. And it's not about you. Because these children need a home where it's going to be happy. And I think that's the key. A happy house, not just any marriage, but a happy marriage. And I wasn't going to bring children into this world if I didn't feel as if we had a strong marriage. And if that meant that I never had children, then I never had children. Because I need my husband to be there with these crazy teens right now who are getting on my last nerve. And I am so glad that he's there to balance my craziness, to keep calm so I don't kill him when they do crazy stuff. That's real stuff. That's why it's important to have an intact family, because there are some checks and balances. When I'm crazy, he's calm. I'm always crazy, so he's always calm. And I just want to tell you two other quick things. In my church, we have a program called 8 at 8. So in our marriage program at our church, we have accountability partners. So we have 4 couples who meet at 8 o'clock to build each other's marriages. So I'm in an 8 at 8 group. We meet every other month. And because of that program, several marriages have been changed within our group, have been saved because of this group. Accountability, real stuff. So I'm not just writing about this. I'm not just reading reports. I'm actually out there having an effect on this. I'm not waiting for anybody to create anything. I created it because I feel that marriages have to be strong, and especially in the African American community. And let's be clear about how while why our marriages weren't always endorsed. We understand what the effect of slavery was. We were not encouraged to have intact families. There were welfare penalties if a man stayed in the home. And so we have to overcome all of that. That doesn't just happen, 3,000 years ago. I mean, it was only in my lifetime that I have the right to vote. We have to recognize that. And lastly, and then I'm going to get off my soapbox because I'm very passionate about this, is that I think we can have a successful campaign to encourage this to succeed. And in my household, I have 3 children, 19, 16, and 14. And this is my standard lecture to them. I don't tell them to go out, and I don't assume that they're going to have sex in their 20s. I say don't have it because I'm going to kill you. And this is the campaign I have. I said there's road A, and there's road B. And road A, we have saved for you to go to college. You don't have to borrow $1 in debt. We have saved for all 3 of my children. We don't make a huge amount of money, but we've saved over the years to send every one of them to college debt-free. This is the road. You can go and stay on campus. Might be an in-state school because we don't have Harvard money, but that's okay. You can get a vehicle to get to school. We will encourage you. We will give you a monthly stipend. We will help you find an internship. We're going to do all the what. Road A is a good life. It's a really good life. Now, road B, you go out there and you get a boo, and you do all the kinds of things, and you drink, and you get drugs, and you get pregnant. I'm going to love you because that's what we have to be. We have to be compassionate. I'm going to love you, but you're not going to be staying on college campus. You're going to community college, then you're going to transfer to a 4-year university, and I'm not babysitting anybody. I'm going to love my grandchild, but you're going to take care of her. This guy, he's not coming into my house, and you're not living and shacking up in my house. I'm not encouraged. If you don't love him, don't marry him, but all that stuff is not going to happen. So that's road B. Which road you want? And my 19-year-old, who is at the University of Maryland, told that story to her other kids at Maryland. And now when they're about to do something that they're not quite sure about, they ask my daughter, is this road A or is this road B? That's all I have to say.
I don't know if I can match that. All right. I'm going to try and keep this fairly quick. Also, I think I might be the furthest left person in this room. So I feel a little bit of a responsibility to speak up for my fellow lefties. At the very beginning of this, I noticed Bob Lerman, he asked, why is it that there isn't more discussion about the role of family in inequality, and specifically, especially amongst people on progressives, really, who focus on these issues so much. First off, I don't know that's true. He pointed out to the Raj Chetty study about mobility, and if you look down the authors listed on that, you'll notice that one of them is Emmanuel Saez, who is, who's a longtime collaborator with Thomas Piketty. This is something that academics on the left are aware of, that Timothy Noah, when he was writing The Great Divergence a few years ago, one of the first major books on inequality, had devoted a whole chapter to the role of family. I don't think it's something that's been ignored. That said, I think there is a degree of nervousness that when for lack of a better word, conservatives focus on the role of single mothers, it's changing the conversation away from top-level inequality, where so much of the action is right now, where the big change is. And that is, I think, where just some of the discord in this conversation comes from, that there's a sense that both sides are trying to change the conversation away from the main priority, and there's a great lack of trust. Right? Ross and I joked before we came on that maybe we should just arm wrestle rather than actually have rather than debate, just about whoever one would write a piece supporting the other person's favored policy or something. But that's kind of we're kidding, but there's a sense that if you sit there and talk about single mothers, you're not talking about the rise of the 0.1%. You're not talking about what's really driving wealth inequality. And if you want a sense of what progressives are looking at right now, I suggest you go take a look at the recent NBER paper by Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, which shows that the rise in wealth inequality in this country, or they find a rise of wealth inequality, which is somewhat controversial, but has been driven overwhelmingly not by the 10% or the 1%, but the 0.1%. And changes in family structure just cannot explain that. And so, again, there is this sense that if we are talking about one, we're not talking about the other, and that's where this, I think,
it's a question policy-wise. Can we chew gum and talk, can we walk and chew gum at the same time? And I don't know if Congress or if the American public or certainly Congress has shown ability to do that. That said, I actually do like this report in a lot of respects. I think it makes what seems like a common sense point. Marriage is good for men, it's good for women, it's good for children, and life is not like Gilmore Girls. You don't have a kid, and single parents don't necessarily have the easiest road of it. I think that we can coalesce around that, even if we don't know the exact reasons why marriage is necessarily has, whether or not it's responsible people getting married or marriage making people more responsible. I think, like Ross said, we can kind of come together and say we should encourage stable families. That said, when you get to the policy specifics, then you can kind of see how the discord comes back, or how the disagreements are going to start up again. The child tax credit, I think there's some consensus around that, but at the same time, it's a huge ask. Right now, we spend $60 billion a year on it. You want to triple its size, essentially, or maybe I'm reading that wrong, but it's about, you want to triple, basically from $1,000 to $3,000. There are a huge number of priorities that you're going to have to basically write off if you're going to spend that much on a tax cut. Liberals might say we can do universal pre-K. Heck, we can probably do it for 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds for less than the cost of a larger tax credit, and that might help families at a more fragile and economically kind of vulnerable point in their lives when they have very young children. They're probably making less money. Again, it's what are you with these sorts of with the tax cut first approach. I think you have to discuss trade-offs, and that's going to be a point where, again, consensus breaks down. I think I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Okay. I have a couple questions, Brad, for you, and then others can comment if they don't mind, and then we'll open it up to the discussion, to the group. The first has to do with, Brad, as a kind of just a definitional issue, and I want to be clear about this, because in the world I came from, some effort was made to shore up incomes and parenting ability of the non-custodial parent. That's some part of what's going on in public policy in the last 15 years. And the question I have, and because sometimes you refer to marriage and then intact family, what is the data, or what is your impression of the ability to mitigate these negative consequences through something short of marriage by improving the parental involvement of the absent parent, or his income? How do you look at, how does your study come down on that?
Well, I think there was a lot of consensus articulated this morning and even now about sort of the value of the stable two-parent family, and I think that's extends across much of, if not all, the political and ideological spectrum. Where I think that consensus breaks down is whether or not marriage per se has to be specifically named and claimed as part of that stable two-parent family model. And both with regards to public policies, but just more generally the cultural conversation around these questions. And I would say that it does, that marriage is an institution, and that, I think the left tends to appreciate institutions when they relate to public policy or education or the labor force, but for some reasons their kind of regard for institutions breaks down around the M word. But this is a cross-cultural thing. This is not a Christian thing or a Jewish thing. This is a sort of trans-cultural institution. It's structured obviously in different ways at different moments in time, but I would say we have to sort of, if we're going to kind of renew stable two-parent families for the 21st century, that's going to come through some kind of marriage model. And we see even in Sweden, for instance, which is held up oftentimes as, even in Sweden, yes. Even in Sweden, kids born to married parents are much more likely to see their parents, make it compared to kids born to cohabiting parents. So my point is that marriage and family stability go together like a hand in glove. And it doesn't mean marriage has to be a 1950s model, but we have to figure out some new kind of marriage model for this century if we want to renew family stability for this century.
And then I want to pick up on something Michelle said, and that is that, and I want the rest of the panel to pipe in on this. Given the the data that's pretty strong with regard to the shortcomings and outcomes, especially for children. Do you envision a governmental intervention absence reducing or increasing the marriage rates that could be successful in improving outcomes for children in single-parent families?
I think that we can do that. I think we have to change our language and how I think the ideal is the success sequence, but when people make different choices, we have to have a safety net. And I don't think we should say redistribution, because that makes it sound, it is. People feel like you're taking something from me rather than strengthening our economy, our communities. And I hate this left, right, conservative. I'm not any of that. I'm all of it. And I think that we have to stop being so adversarial about this issue and judgmental. If someone is a single mom, okay, they made a decision. Let's see how we can help that particular family structure survive. And if that means perhaps a tax credit or a program that will help that person be a better mom and involve the father. We have a court system that really alienates a lot of men once that happens, and if there's divorce and there's a mom and every other weekend and all this stuff going on that doesn't strengthen the intact family. And I just think we have to stop being so adversarial, stop being judgmental, and yes, there's government intervention that has to happen, but there's also community intervention, and that's it. It's the convergence of both of those that are going to strengthen these families, I believe.
Jordan, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard not to be adversarial when you do have competing. When you talk about strengthening the safety net or whatnot, you have competing desires on both sides and competing priorities. So there has to be some fighting. I think they're just by the nature
I
of the
disagree
political
with
process.
that. Why is there?
Well, you've limited resources, but I do think. I mean, also.
Yeah, no, I
mean,
disagree with that. I totally disagree with that. I'm sorry. Because it is in all of our interest that we have strong families. Everyone's interest. It is not competing at all.
Well, unless you can literally just take if you can throw the whole kitchen sink at it, then that's one approach. And I think I personally take a more the merrier approach, just spend. But not everyone agrees, and so it's hard. You have to make trade-offs. I do think also, though, what you did say about not judging, I do think that comes back to Ross's point about stigma and changing the culture. I worry when I hear the word stigma, partly politically, because that has led to so much of the contentiousness about this. I mean, stigmatizing single mothers is part of what led to the welfare queen debate, or what led to, it's what gives liberals
I believe you mean what led to welfare reform?
Well, yeah, and the reason a lot of liberals have acid flashbacks about welfare reform. So, stigma plays. Stigma is a dangerous word, and I don't even know it's necessary. I finished Isabel's book just recently. I want to just give her a plug. It's a really great book. Anyone who's thinking about these issues should read it. And one of the points she makes is that, or one of my takeaways is we don't necessarily have to radically change the culture. There are a lot of people who do want to live through the success sequence, who that's their plan, and they make a mistake. You don't want to underestimate human folly when you're making policy, and that's one of the reasons why contraceptives seem like such a good option. You don't have to change the entire culture to just educate people about IUDs or about how to take the pill appropriately, and that seems like a much smaller and potentially consensus bill, or a much more consensus way to go about it than stigmatizing single moms or somehow mysteriously doing that.
Brad?
Yeah, I think that on this question, the sort of the stigma strategy is unworkable, obviously. But I think what we can do and should do is to basically hold out this notion that, look, it's pretty clear that most college-educated Americans are pursuing this success strategy, and to sort of unpack it, explain it, and make it attractive and a compelling narrative. Not the only thing that we do, but something that's accessible to people across this, the sociological spectrum, if you will. And that's, I think, part of what the cultural agenda that I'm around is seeking to do. And I don't think we do enough in our public institutions, including the media and the pop culture, to be very clear about this is the sequence that, on average, works for most adults and their kids. If we did more of that, not just in a utilitarian way, but kind of as part of a narrative about connecting people to the American dream, I think that would be helpful in changing behavior as part and parcel of a larger agenda.
Can I speak up for reactionary stigma and so forth? Just briefly, I think that, a few points. One, what Michelle described as, the talk that you give to your children, and the sort of system of carrots and sticks, if you will, that you hold out to them in terms of thinking about their relationship to you and their adult life. That is a pattern of aspiration and stigma. It's not stigma in the sense of shunning your children, which, and sort of cutting them off from polite society or anything like that, but that kind of view, that kind of message as taught to children by parents, and, as imparted by communal organizations and civic organizations and so on. That strategy, I think, while I certainly agree with Brad and everyone else that, as I said myself, it's hard to imagine generating the level of consensus to sort of build it up beyond the level of the family. That is the kind of model that human beings actually respond to, and I really think they respond to it more fully than they respond, again, to sort of just straight utilitarian arguments, to parents saying, you need to make these choices because I have a pamphlet here that projects that your income will be higher in 10 years. No, your parents have to make it clear that at some level, as much as they'll love you, they will be disappointed in you if you make a certain set of decisions. And some of those decisions have to do with when you get a job and when you get married and when you have a kid. Some of those decisions just have to do with who you have sex with. And this is something, obviously, where liberals and conservatives, for reasons that relate to the sexual revolution, to religion, to lots of different things, tend to disagree. And the liberal view, generally speaking, is that the pursuit of sexual fulfillment is a really important liberty and a really important good, and needs to be defended against reactionary types like myself who want to sort of claw us back to a darker era. And I think the reasonable conservative view is that liberals are right that the culture has changed dramatically, and liberals are also right that there was never an era when, people were all living up to some traditional model of marriage and sex and sexuality and so on. But a basic point like, if you're having sex with someone, it should be someone that you think you might consider marrying, which was sort of, in a sense, the older model, in the sense that people had premarital sex that was more likely to be premarital, in the sense that you were willing to have sex if you were having sex with a steady boyfriend or girlfriend with whom you could imagine, if it happened, having a kid. I don't think that model is irrelevant or antiquated or out of date, and I think it is ultimately more humane than the sexual landscape that we have now. More humane for people who want to form relationships, more humane for the children who come out of their relationships, and I think it is compatible with a basic view in gender equality and a basic view that if people fall off that success sequence, you're not going to, shun them or kick them out of your Amish community. You're still going to love them and care for them, but they will feel a little bit of shame, and that's okay. And my anxiety with the sort of current liberal vision, and Belle and I were talking a little bit about her book beforehand, and she was saying that I've failed to write something both about it and specifically, I think, about this issue of long-acting contraception that has become a really interesting and important point of debate in this landscape. One of the reasons I haven't written something about it is because I have a sort of fraught reaction to it that's undoubtedly connected to my being Catholic and pro-life and so on, and there are sort of blurry areas with long-acting contraception around some of those issues, but it's also just connected to my overall sense that the big problem we have in our culture right now is that a lot of people don't know how to make choices that lead to having happy, durable, romantic relationships. And I worry about a policy agenda that says, we haven't figured out how to do that, but here's something you can take so you won't get pregnant. And I think that can only succeed in getting us where we ultimately want to go if it's connected to a broader vision about marriage and family and human flourishing that I don't think we have any kind of consensus around. And this, I'm going on, but just to wrap up, to get back to your original question about policy interventions, I think the way you think about policy interventions depends on where you want to go. And this, again, is a big left-right difference, that if your goal is income equality, wealth equality, that can be achieved to some extent. It's been achieved to some extent in Europe without fixing some of these sort of human relationship-based problems. And I think it can be fixed. You know, you can go beyond a child tax credit and, you know, I mean, these sort of incentive goosing proposals, and you can just do more straight-up redistribution, and you can do more sex education, and you can do more, you know, I have some skepticism about that being the sort of easy way to change behavior, but you know, people's behaviors can change, and you can combine that with the availability of long-acting contraception, and you know, you can get to a point where there's more equality of income and outcomes in the U.S. But I don't know if that gets you to a point of actual equality of family structures, and that's something that I'm interested in, because getting beyond all the utilitarian arguments, you know, I think that growing up with your biological mother or father is a great human good, and one that should be available to people regardless of the economic circumstances they're born into. And I'm a little uncomfortable with a policy response that sort of says, we don't know how to get back there, so we're just going to sort of, you know, equalize outcomes and not equalize those more basic and fundamental human goods.
Okay, I would like to see the questions right there in the first row, gentleman with the beard.
Gerald Chandler. I'd like to ask Michelle Singletary, are these problems being solved by mothers like you? That is to say that people who grew up in single parent households, are they in the large majority drawing the lessons that you did and teaching their kids what you've done it, or is it the opposite?
I don't have the data at hand to say, are there more people? You're basically asking, are there more people like me? And anecdotally, in the programs that I raise, I think that there are a lot of people who want to have that sequence success. They want a nice, stable family. But there was something Bob said in his panel about having courses or programs to help people make better decisions and communicate better. And I really think that that's where we have to start, because in the programs that I run, one of the key things we do before we get to budgeting and family and all these things, we talk about better decision making. And so to answer your question, I think there are more people who desire to do what I do. I'm not sure that they've taken all the steps to get there. I didn't just come out like this. I know I look brilliant. But I've spent a fair amount of time taking courses and taking classes and going to church and studying and doing the things that I need to be a better wife and a better mother and a better worker at my job, because I work at a very high stress place with a lot of crazy people. Please don't tweet that. And so I have to have resources at hand to be a better person. And I don't think that there's enough of that. We sort of shove people out and say succeed without all the tools. We know how to make money now. We teach them how to work at a job, but we don't teach them how to handle the conflict resolution things that are going to be on a job. We tell women that, you know, you don't have to have a man, but then we say marriage is a great institution, but then we don't teach people how to be husbands and wives. And so it doesn't magically happen, just like parenting doesn't magically happen. I'm a better parent because I took parenting courses, and my husband took parenting courses, and we're constantly reading, trying to be better at what we do. And therefore, I think my children will be better at it. And I agree. I don't think we use stigma, but I'm all for horror stories. I tell them horror stories all the time about what happens when you make bad decisions. And so I think there are more people like me, yes. Can there be more? Absolutely. Because I'm all about us having a better quality of life. And for me, marriage works from the beginning to the end, because now we have end-of-life issues. We have long-term care issues. When we have more single-family homes and families fractured, who's going to take care of all these elderly folks? I mean, my husband, because we're intact, we have better resources, we have better communication skills. When his father was ill and came into my house, I helped take care of him. I couldn't have taken care of this crazy old man who was really, really dark unless I had a better relationship with my husband, because otherwise both of them would have had to leave my house. Right. So I think that is the key. And I think what Bob said, we sort of maybe didn't really concentrate on that. We've got to have programs to teach people essentially to be better people.
Okay, Josh?
I just have a question about, to this question Robert raised about government interventions and whether they could potentially work somehow, someday, about reconciling with the welfare state, which Nick mentioned earlier today. I remember in 2006 and following with the Bush initiative around healthy marriage initiatives, sort of seeing an idea at the top among the politicals that wasn't necessarily translated all the way down into the sort of TANF officials at HHS who were implementing this thing. And of course it still continues today, the Healthy Marriage Initiative. It's changed a bit. But what would be, it's probably a question for Brad, what would be your best piece of advice about how to make the ahas of this report, the marriage divide, the divergent destinies, somehow popularized in a way that would still reconcile with the surrogate parent function of the welfare state today?
That's a terribly tough question that you've just posed, Josh. I think let me shift a little bit here, and I think what I would like to say is that in terms of, because there obviously have been debates about sort of the efficacy of marriage education or relationship education campaigns and skills, and most of the evidence is not very encouraging. There are exceptions like in Oklahoma. But the question, I guess, becomes, can the welfare state do much to strengthen marriage? Is that sort of the basic question you're posing to us?
Yes, and wrestling a bit with the impulses of the welfare state's administration.
Yeah, and are the administrators who are part of the welfare state, capable of really getting behind that message and agenda? Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't think we really know the answer to that to that question. I guess I'm on this issue, I share actually some skepticism that my more progressive conversation partners would have about whether these programs, scaled up across the country, can work. And I think it's an open question. And I would actually point to a more progressive program, and that is to Head Start. We have obviously good examples in North Carolina and Michigan that did do a lot, but they were focusing on small populations and they had a lot of resources. As we scaled up all that pre-K, all those programs, they haven't had market successes in the country as a whole. So I think it's an open question about whether or not the federal government, acting as the federal government, for instance, can really do a lot to change behaviors and attitudes. And that's actually why I think on the cultural side of things and the civic side of things, it's got to be much more about the private sector, civil society, and even businesses doing a lot more around these issues and questions, because I think they have a lot more flexibility and freedom to go right to the heart of the matter in ways that, for obvious reasons, that the federal government and state and local governments often do not. So that's an important, I think. I'm more inclined on a lot of these issues to say that this sort of private sector, both businesses and civic institutions, have to do a lot more if we're going to make any headway on this.
As a former welfare administrator, we did in New York do a public campaign on the consequences or difficulties of raising children and successfully in a single-parent family. And we got some blowback, but we also got general acceptance. And so I think there is an opportunity there. Belle, I would like you to have the last question. Oh, my gosh. Yes. Right. So, any further comments from anyone on our panel? What?
Oh, no, I was going to say Jordan maybe.
Jordan?
Oh, I mean,
I ran it already.
no, I think that, again, it just kind of comes back to the question of, do you think we're kind of fallen as a culture, or do you think that we're, fallible and we make mistakes? And I think that ensuring against those mistakes is probably the easiest and possibly most fruitful way of going about it. So I'm just, I guess, echoing that point and summarizing. But that was, so yeah, I mean.
Just to your point, I really, because I deal with these folks directly. I mean, when they have budget issues, when they're single parents, when marriages is breaking up. I do love your last point about, thinking. And again, I think it goes back to Bob's point. As we're talking about tax credits and all these other things, I think it's imperative that we help young folks really think through the decisions that they're making and the long-term economic impact of that moment of pleasure that could change not just your life, but that child's life and your family legacy. And that has been my passion to try, and that's what I do in my column, that I try to get people to think really about what they're going to do. And that's, I do it in my ministry work, I do it with my own children, and I do it in my column, just getting people to slow down and think. Because that moment of pleasure, that guy and that baby is going to be with you for a lifetime. And if all of us in this room, if we can have an impact on that, we would just have such a better society with people not so stressed out. We'd probably have less child abuse, less spousal abuse, a whole lot of less if we get people to think about what they're doing and who they're hooking up with. And just, I really do think that we have to have more marriage preparation, which is why I love the program at my church, Do You Think You Want to Get Married? And to me, that is one of the first solutions that we actually have control over. Because Lord knows we can't get the Congress to do much of anything.
And with that, thank you all very much. Great panel. Thank you.